Good morning. Grateful to have everyone here with us this morning. I'm especially grateful to have my wife and my baby girl with me this morning. I figured now that I've been a dad for 2 weeks, I should preach on parenting maybe, since I got it all figured out by now, but we'll probably wait another couple weeks because I got a couple more kinks to work out. But no, we're grateful that you're here this morning. We're appreciative that you have taken the time to come together to worship God and to use this day as a day of exaltation of the Father, of the Son, and of the Spirit. I hope that as we enter into this period of study this morning that we do so with open hearts and open minds, ready to learn and to grow and to become better servants of His. We talked about last week, we talked about some of the sevens of the Sabbath, and included within that, we talked about Jesus' miracles upon the Sabbath. And that's what we're going to focus on this morning. So we're going to talk about what it looked like when Jesus showed what Jesus was meant to show upon the day of Sabbath. Now, these things acted not just as a show of mercy to those who were struggling. These things not only acted as a way of showing that Jesus was sent from God, it was a way of showing His power and the ability that He had, but it was also used as a tool to help people to understand their true mindsets and where their minds should really be, as well as the true intention of the day, of the Sabbath. Now, some of these principles can be carried over into today's society as well, even in the absence of Jesus physically here in a physical form and performing physical miracles on a Sabbath day. We still have some counterparts that we can help to understand. We can still look back to these miracles and see that Jesus truly is from God. We can look at the miracle that is the Bible itself, and it's all of its many authors over many years compiled into one collection of words that helps us to see the true nature and the meaning of God's will for man. And so it can edify us and strengthen us and show us that Jesus truly is from God. It can also strengthen and encourage us by showing us love and mercy. It takes us through times of turmoil, times of distress, times of heartache and problems within our lives, and gives us hope of something that is far better to come. And yes, we do not have a Sabbath day that we're commanded to practice, and I continue to try and make that as clear as I can within this study. However, we do have a day that we can worship God. And it's very important that, like the Sabbath and those who Jesus was ministering to, that we do not forget the true purpose behind today, which is to worship the Lord that we serve. It is to worship the God of all creation. So it's important that we can take these very same and similar messages that we hear from Jesus on the Sabbath and use it to be reminded of why we're here in the first place, to worship God and to do so with all of our hearts. I'm going to start by looking very briefly at Matthew chapter 12. We spent a lot of time in Matthew chapter 12 a few weeks back, so I don't want us to dive too deeply within it. But you'll be reminded of Jesus' interaction upon that day. You look beginning in verse 9 through 14, you see here that when Jesus had departed from there, He went into their synagogue. And behold, there was a man with a withered hand. And they asked Him, saying, "Is it lawful to heal upon the Sabbath?" Now, I'll remind you of something, and I'll go ahead and make notes so it pops up later too. This is not the only time that He's going to be asked this very similar question. Is it lawful to work? Is it lawful to heal? Is it lawful to do such and such upon the Sabbath? And they did this for the purpose that they might accuse Him. Now, verse 11 says, He said unto them, "What man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good upon the Sabbath." And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. Then the Pharisees went out and plotted against Him that they might destroy Him. I want us to be reminded of a few things concerning Matthew chapter 12. Jesus is using this interaction as a way of pointing towards the focus, the true focus of this Sabbath day. And as part of that, the true focus of God's focus, the thing that He desires from man. It's not this stringent following of every little detail. It is to do so with faithfulness, with obedience, coupled with love, mercy, and justice, coupled with faith. And the problem was that it wasn't that they weren't keeping the law to a T. They were doing their best to keep the law to a T, but they had forgotten the purpose behind it. And the same warning can be given to us on our days of worship as well. It's important that we do everything that God has required for us to ask us to do upon worship. But those actions can become vain if we do not focus upon its true purpose, upon its true intention. Okay, I said we weren't going to spend much time on it. That's all from Matthew chapter 12. Let's keep going. Mark chapter 1. You notice in verses 21 through 28, they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath He entered into the synagogue, and Jesus began to teach. That was verse 21 of Mark 1. We're getting into verse 22. And they were astonished at His teaching, And they taught them as one having authority, and not as he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. And there was a man in their synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, "Let us alone. What have we to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Did you come to destroy us? I know you are holy. You are the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be quiet, and come out of him." When the unclean spirit had convulsed him, he cried out with a loud voice, and he came out of him. And they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, "What is this? What new doctrine is this? With authority he commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And immediately his fame spread throughout all the region around Galilee. There's a specific message that we see in Matthew chapter 12 that is carried over a little bit into Mark chapter 1, not in the sense that it's the same message, but I mean the same principle. Jesus, in the intention of the recording of Matthew chapter 12, is to remind them that Jesus is the Lord of Sabbath. This is a day of rest. This is a day of edification. This is a day of glorifying God. And Jesus is in control or in charge of that day. He has authority. And we see that very same authority being shown in Mark chapter 1. Now, the interesting part about it being shown in Mark chapter 1 is it's less so showing the authority over the day and more so showing the authority with which he speaks and with which he works. You'll notice it in his teachings that he begins to speak, and it fills them with amazement. Why were they filled with amazement? Because he taught as one having authority. Now you'll notice specifically here, he mentions not just that he teaches as one who has authority, but he also mentions another group, not as the scribes. He doesn't talk as somebody who seems to be repeating the message. He talks as if he is the one who is the author of the message. And coincidentally, that's exactly the case. He's not some scribe who is simply repeating something that he had read. He is the Word in the flesh. He has the authority. He is the author. And so when he speaks to this group of people, he speaks with authority because he has authority. Not just within the word that he speaks, but within his actions as well. Because you'll notice that they were all filled with amazement once again, not just at his teaching ability or his ability to deliver with authority. They were also filled with amazement at his ability to cast out demons and the authority that he has to cast out demons. This man obviously must be from God, and he speaks not as one who's like a scribe who repeats. He speaks as one who has authority to deliver this message in the first place. They recognize within their amazement that there is something that is different about this Jesus. Now, that's the purpose of miracles. That's the focus of his miracles, to show that there is something that is different about this man. He's not just any man. He is sent from God. And even going so far as to be placed above that of the authority of the scribes. He's not just somebody who repeats a message that he heard. He speaks with authority. He acts with authority. And notice the response to this is in verse 28 of Mark chapter 1. Immediately his fame spread throughout all the region of Galilee. These individuals were amazed, and their response was not to keep quiet about it, but rather their response was to simply point others to Jesus. They began to talk and were filled with amazement. They began to tell others throughout the whole region of Galilee about this Jesus. Why? Because they saw his true beauty and his true power in not just his teaching, but also in his actions in miraculous ways. You keep going in that very same chapter. This next section, if you will, in verse 29, it's continuing on the Sabbath day. Still still in the synagogue, at least when the verse starts. As soon as they had come out of the synagogue, verse 29, they entered into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. But Simon's wife's mother, so Peter's mother-in-law, lay sick with a fever. And they told him about her at once. So he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and immediately the fever left her. And she served them. At evening, when the sun had set, they brought to him all who were sick and those who were demon-possessed. And the whole city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he did not allow the demons to speak because they knew him. I want you to notice a few things about Jesus' interactions, not just with the sick, but also with the demon-possessed. He has already shown in two ways before they start bringing the sick and the demon-possessed in droves. He has already shown his authority over those individuals. You look at that first section that we read in Mark chapter 1. What does he do? He casts out a demon. You see, once he leaves the synagogue, he goes into Peter and Andrew's house, and is informed of Peter's mother-in-law who is sick. So what does he do? Well, he heals the sick. And then after that, he begins to have people to bring others to him, those who were sick, those who were demon-possessed. Notice verse 33 says, and the whole city was gathered together at the door. They were witnessing the power of God in action upon the Sabbath day. They were witnessing as Jesus used His authority not just in the Word, but over sickness and over even the demon possession. But notice how Jesus handles this. Verse 34 says that He healed many who were sick with various diseases. He cast out many demons, but yet He did not allow the demons to speak because they knew Him. You'll be reminded of what He said toward the first demon that we saw in the synagogue. He was speaking out towards Jesus. He even saw the authority that Jesus had. And yet in this moment, Jesus does not allow for these demons to speak. Why? Well, because they knew Him. They wanted the actions that were taking. He wanted the actions that were taking place to speak for Him, not for the demons to speak for Him. And so in these instances, we're already seeing that within these three that we've looked at, we've seen as Jesus enters into synagogues, practices as He should on Sabbath. He does a lot of wonderful works and follows after the law, but all while focusing on the true intention of that day, to give rest to a restless people. He sees those who are demon-possessed. In fact, we're going to look at a couple who have been dealing with illnesses or sicknesses for quite some time. He sees those individuals and He sees their restlessness. And so He gives them rest. That's the true intention of the day, to give rest to restless people. And to do so through love and mercy. And so what Jesus does is He does that very thing. And then we get over to Luke chapter 13. I know we're flipping a lot everywhere, but I'm going to try and give you a second to flip over to Luke chapter 13. If you want to go ahead and flip over as well, we're going to go from 13 to 14, and we're going to look at John 5 and John 9, and then I'll let the lesson be yours. So Luke 13 and 14, John 5, John 9. You can go ahead and get prepared a little bit more. Now He was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and behold, there was a woman who had a spirit of infirmity. Notice this, 18 years, and was bent over and could in no way raise herself up. But when the Jews saw her, He called her to Him, and He said to her, Woman, you are loosed from your infirmity. And He laid His hands on her, and immediately she was made straight and glorified God. But the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation because Jesus had healed upon the Sabbath. And he said unto the crowd, There are 6 days on which men ought to work. Therefore come and be healed on them, and not on the Sabbath day. Then the Lord answered and said unto him, Hypocrite, does not each one of you on the Sabbath day loose his ox or his donkey from the stall, and lead it away to water it? So ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound of it for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath? When he had said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the multitude rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him. I love verse 17. I absolutely love the verse. Notice, let's read it one more time together because we're going to talk about it in a second, but let's just read verse 17 one more time together. When he had said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the multitude rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him. Those who withstood Jesus were put to shame. Those who became an adversary, an enemy, one who opposes the Savior, were put to shame. And the multitude rejoiced. Why? Because of the glorious things, the things that gave God glory that were done by him. I just think I think it's an absolutely beautiful verse. It's one of my favorites. But let's look back a little bit more, and then we'll get to that in a second. Notice this woman, 18 years has this infirmity. And the description of it is that she was bent over to where she could not stand up straight. For 18 years, this has been something that she is dealing with. And Jesus simply tells her to stand up straight. Your back has been loosened. Your infirmity has been taken away. And so what does she do? Well, she stands up. She was made straight. She stands up straight. And they glorified God. But notice the ruler of the synagogue, witnessing what had just been done, this miraculous event, this woman who had been dealing with this infirmity for 18 years, he witnesses she is able to stand up straight for the first time in 18 years. He is filled with indignation, and he said, there are 6 days in which men ought to work. Therefore, be healed on one of them, and not on the Sabbath day. He just witnessed as someone in his presence performed a miracle on somebody who had been facing this illness for 18 years. And the first thought of this ruler of the Sabbath was not to praise God, but was to seek to rebuke Jesus for showing mercy to the one who was in need of mercy, to giving rest to the one who is in need of rest. You see the problem there? The ruler of the synagogue, the one who was meant to focus and bring forth their minds towards this day of rest, is rebuking Jesus the Christ because of his showing of mercy upon upon the Sabbath day. The result of which is that God is not glorified through his actions, but the result of which is that God is glorified through Jesus. Notice how Jesus responds. He mentions, first he calls him a hypocrite, which is very important because he does that quite a bit to open their eyes a little bit. But he also reminds them of their own actions. This is why you're a hypocrite. Because anybody who has an ox or a donkey takes it to get water upon the Sabbath day. And yet this woman, who, notice, is a daughter of Abraham, she is a Jewish woman, you don't want to show her mercy upon this day. She needs to come on another day. She's been loosed from this infirmity, but it is not something that is pleasing within your sight because it happened on the Sabbath, not because it happened any of the other 6 days of the week. This is what happens when we lose focus upon that day. Not we ourselves focusing upon the Sabbath, but when we focus upon the wrong things concerning our day of worship. Something wonderful and amazing was done in the presence of those who were gathered around seeking after understanding. And instead of rejoicing with this woman who had been loosed from this infirmity, Jesus was rebuked and was sought to be cast out. Why? Because he practiced this upon the Sabbath day. They lost the true intention of the day. They had forgotten the true meaning to give rest to restless people on that day, and the result of which is instead of glorifying God, they rebuked God for doing what he is set to do. I mentioned we get over to Luke chapter 14. Let's flip over one more page to Luke chapter 14. We'll look at verse 1 through 6. Now it happened as he went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath. They watched him closely, and behold, there was a certain man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus answering spoke to the lawyers and the Pharisees, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Notice, this is Jesus the one that is seeking to find this answer. Because he asked the Pharisees and the lawyers. But they kept silent. And they took him, and he took him and healed him and let him go. And they answered, saying, he answered, saying, which of you, having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into the pit, will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they could not answer him regarding these things. Now the tables have turned a little bit. Where they're not in the synagogue, it is the Sabbath, and Jesus is not the one who is being questioned. Jesus is the one doing the questioning. He's in the presence of the Pharisees in their house. And the saddest part to me is that last little statement in verse 1 of Luke chapter 14. They were watching him closely. They were waiting. They were looking for something. And notice what Jesus does. A certain man comes in who has dropsy. Jesus begins to question them and ask them, these lawyers and these Pharisees who were watching him closely, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? It's the very same question that Jesus had been asked at times. But they kept silent. And so Jesus takes him and he heals him and he lets him go. And he reminds them of their own actions, of taking their ox, taking their donkeys, and going and taking them to get something to drink, or in this specific instance, when they fall into a pit, they remove them. Why? Because they show mercy to the things that they care about. Yet in this moment, they're looking for something. They're looking for something for him to slip up on, for him to do wrong, and yet Jesus is putting their focus once again back upon the purpose of this day. And notice verse 6. They could not answer him regarding these things. I find it interesting that every time that Jesus is asked a question by the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees, the lawyers, they're always posing these questions, these difficult questions, trying to entrap them. And typically the end of it is either they get angry and seek to kill him, or they have a lot of confusion because he shows them something that they had never thought of, or at least he shows them the true meaning of something that they had forgotten. And so they're ashamed. And so notice what happens here. Jesus poses this question again. He immediately talks about this oxen and the donkey being pulled out, and they could not answer him regarding these things. These are the lawyers. These are the Pharisees. These are the ones who examine the law in depth. These are the ones who examine it and are supposed to be able to share the message of the law with the people. And yet they are astonished at this mindset of, is it lawful to heal upon the Sabbath? Is it right or wrong for you to do good, to show mercy, to give rest to restless people on the day that its true intention is to give rest to restless people. Let's look over at John chapter 5. We'll look at John 5 and John 9, and then I'll let you go for this morning. I want you to notice with John chapter 5, though, something that's a little interesting, and it's a little interesting and a lot debated. Some people aren't sure about John chapter 5. And what I mean by that is some manuscripts have some difficulty lining up with some things. And so some people argue that John chapter 5 shouldn't be in the Bible. Some argue that it is. Most people agree that it should be in the Bible. That's why you have it in your modern translation. That's why you don't skip a whole chapter. You've got this moment with the pool of Bethesda. So let's look at it. Verse 1. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. And in these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first, after the stirring of the waters, was made well, and whatever disease he had. Now a certain man was there and had an infirmity. Notice this: 38 years he had been there with this infirmity. And when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been in that condition for a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" And the sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said unto him, "Rise, take up your bed, and walk." And immediately the man was made well. He took up his bed, and he walked. Notice this, and that day was the Sabbath. And the Jews therefore said to him, who was cured? It is the Sabbath day. It is not lawful for you to carry your bed. This man who has had infirmity for 38 years, and the thought process of the Jews that day was, you're carrying your bed. That's not lawful for you to do. Let's keep looking. And he answered and said, "He who made me well has said unto me, take up your bed and walk." And they asked him, "Who is the man who had said unto you, take up your bed and walk?" But the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, a multitude being in that place. Afterward, when Jesus found him in the temple, he said unto him, "See, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you." And the man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. For this reason the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him, because he had done things on the Sabbath. But he answered them, "My Father has been working until now, and I have been working." Once again, long time that this man has been dealing with this infirmity. 38 years. And there is so much within John chapter 5. It's an absolutely beautiful piece of text. John chapter 4 as well, but John chapter 5 especially. You notice that this man has been dealing with this infirmity for many years. And he's waiting upon what? He's waiting on a miracle. He's waiting on this angel to come down to put their finger in the water to stir it up, and then you get down in the water. But what is his problem? It's not just that he has had this infirmity for 38 years. It's that he's been waiting to get into the pool, but before he can get into it, somebody else gets there first. And notice why somebody else gets there first. Because he has nobody to put him into the pool. He has nobody there to help him. And so there's so many things that are an issue here. One, notice this man, he's been dealing with this for 38 years. I've not been alive for 38 years. I know that's not a shocker to y'all. I got quite a while to catch up, honestly, with 38 years. And for 38 years, this man dealt with this infirmity, waiting for some resemblance of relief, waiting for just a moment where he could be the one to get into the pool first and receive relief from this pain that he was suffering. And yet for 38 years, there was still no solution. He was waiting on a miracle. And in the moment where the miracle happened, in the moment where the angel stirred up the water and the first one in was to be healed, other people got there. Why? Because he had nobody who was there to help him. Nobody was willing to help him to get into that pool. 38 years suffering and suffering alone, waiting on a miracle, waiting for something to set him free. And so notice the question that Jesus asked. Do you want to be made well? Do you want to be healed? Do you want to be made well? Man answered, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool while the water is stirred up. While I'm getting up to go, or while I'm trying to get into the pool, another steps in before me." And so Jesus simply says, "Rise, take up your bed, and walk." And he's healed of this infirmity. You see, this moment is waiting on a miracle. This man is waiting on a miracle. He's doing so for 38 years, and he's doing so alone. The immediate thing that pops into my mind is honestly when you begin to have conversations with people. You have people that you know that are waiting on a miracle to get right with God. I'll get right, but it'll be one day. I'll do what's right in the sight of God, but it's not today. I will one day. It seems like they're waiting on some tragedy, some evil or wicked thing to happen, or some horrible thing to happen that scares them and makes them think of death. And then that's the day that they're going to miraculously or magically come to Jesus. A lifetime of sitting there waiting, sitting there alone waiting with this infirmity. And yet notice the solution was not a stirring up of the water. The solution was not having somebody to lower him in. The solution was not getting into that pool of Bethesda. That solution was Jesus. He was waiting on some magical water, this magical stirring up of this water, this miraculous stirring up of this water from the angel to heal him. And yet what he really needed was Jesus. And so notice what happens. Jesus tells him to rise up, take his bed, and walk. And when he does, he's rebuked by the Jewish leaders once again because he is carrying his bed on the Sabbath day. This man who they had probably walked by plenty times. This man who they probably had ignored his pleas for help getting into the pool. This man who they had seen for 38 years deal with this infirmity. They see this man up and walking around, and their response is not to rejoice, is not to glorify God, but to rebuke him because he's carrying his bed upon the Sabbath. They had forgotten once again the importance of what that day was meant to do, to give rest to restless people, and in doing so, to glorify God within the process. So instead of glorifying God, they rebuked this man. And once they discovered that it was this Jesus who had done this thing, once they discovered that Jesus was the one who had told him, notice that they the Jews sought to kill him, verse 16. The Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him, verse 16, instead of rejoicing with what had been done. They had lost their focus on the true intention, on the true nature of that day. And the direct result of it is that this man, while being healed, was rebuked for what had been done. I find it very interesting that man sat for so long, all alone, waiting on a miracle, when really what he needed was Jesus. And at the same time, we come across so many people who sit there all alone, waiting for a miracle to change their lives, when really all what they need is Jesus to be introduced into them. Jesus set this man free. And instead of being rebuked, we should rejoice with this man and what had been done. Let's look at John chapter 9. We'll look at it very quickly. We'll look at John chapter 9. There's a few things that we see concerning John. And one, it includes the pool of Siloam. You'll notice as Jesus was passing by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. This is verse 1. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who has sinned this man or his parents that he was born blind? And he answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming and no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. I want you to notice a few things here very quickly. Notice his disciples. These are the followers of Jesus. Asked him, Rabbi, teacher, master, who has sinned that this man is born blind? Is it him or the sin of his father? Notice his response. It is neither the sin of him nor the sin of his parents, but rather it is so that God could be glorified. Now, we mentioned this being seen several times throughout Scripture, including in the death of Lazarus and the loss of his friend. It was so that he could show his power. God's power could be shown. Let's skip down a little bit to verse 5, and we'll see here, verse 6. When he had said these things, he spat on the ground and made clay with the saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the man born blind with the clay. And he said unto him, Go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated, sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Therefore the neighbors of those who had previously seen this blind man, that he was blind, they said, Is this not he who sat and begged? Some said, This is he. Others said, He is like him. And he said, I am he. Therefore they said unto him, How were your eyes open? They answered and said, A man called Jesus. He answered and said, A man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes. And he said to me, Go and wash in the pool of Siloam. And I went and washed, and I received my sight. They said to him, Where is he? And he said, I do not know. They brought him who formerly was blind to the Pharisees. Now it was the Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. And the Pharisees also asked him again that he had received his sight. And he said to him, He put the clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath." Others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?" And there was a division among them. They said to the blind man, what do you say about him?" I don't know what is going on with my brain right now. They said to the blind man again, "What do you say about him, because he opened your eyes?" And he said, "He is a prophet." But the Jews did not believe concerning him, that he had been blind and received his sight, until they called his parents of him who had received his sight. And they asked him, saying, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered them and said, "We know that this is our son, and we know that he was born blind. But by what means he now sees, we do not know. Or who opened his eyes, we do not know. He is of age, ask him, he will speak for himself." And his parents said these things, notice this, because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, that he would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." So when they again called the man who is blind, he said to him, "Give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered and said, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing that I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him again, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I told you already. You did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become one of his disciples?" That's a real fun question to ask people who are accusing you of being a disciple of Jesus. He's saying, "Oh, you want to hear the story again? You've already asked these questions. You've already asked these things. Do you want to become a disciple of Jesus too? We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from." The man answered and said to them, "Why, this is a marvelous thing, that you do not know where he is from, yet he has opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been heard of that anyone opened the eyes of the one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered and said to him, "You were completely born in sins, and are you teaching us?" And they cast him out. Notice the response here of the Jewish leaders is the same mindset or the same questioning that his own disciples were asking. The disciples or his followers were asking him, "Rabbi, who was born blind? Who was sin that this man was born blind?" And now notice the Jewish leaders here. "You were born in sin. How can you therefore then tell us what we must do? Or how can you teach us anything?" Notice in verse 35. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found them, he said to him, "Do you believe in the Son of God?" He answered and said, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" And Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you." Then he said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. And Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, that those who see may be made blind." Then some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these words and said to him, "Are we blind also?" And Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say, 'We see,' therefore your sin remains." Notice throughout all this endeavor with the Pharisees, with the Jewish leaders in the synagogues, with the parents of the blind man, with the blind man himself, with Jesus, the entire time these people are seeking to speak out or rebuke Jesus, and yet Jesus has simply given sight to a blind man who had never seen in his entire life. We don't know the specific age of him, but at least from the words of his parents, he was of the age of accountability. He said, "He's old enough, ask him. Don't ask us these questions, ask him." And the saddest part about it is they were pointing to their son to answer these questions, not necessarily because they didn't know that, yes, they didn't know everything, but they were pointing to their son because they were fearful of what the Jews would do to them. And to me, that's just one of the saddest things. They were fearful of the spiritual leaders of their area because of what had been done to their son, this miraculous act that had been done on the Sabbath day. They were fearful of the Jewish leaders of kicking them out of the synagogue. Strangely enough, they were trying to do something that was in direct directly against God's purpose of the Sabbath is to draw all people together, to have unity, to have peace, to seek after comfort, and to give rest. And yet in this instance, they're trying to cause discomfort. They're splitting up families. They're casting people out of the synagogue. Why? Because a man carried a bed on the Sabbath day. All because Jesus spit and made some clay, rubbed it on his eyes, and showed mercy in allowing for a man to see. And in trying to find out all these things about Jesus, instead of having their eyes to be open to become like disciples, their eyes had become closed. They had become blind to the true nature of Jesus. They had become blind to the true beauty of his work. And the result of which is that this man can face judgment with confidence, having his eyes physically and spiritually open to see the Son and the Father and the Spirit. And yet these Jewish leaders, the ones who initially were to be the ones to help to show people the way of God, are completely blinded because of their own indignation or because of their own beliefs, their own hearts, and their own traditions. So what can we learn from this? I know there's a lot, and I know we've covered 7 different sections and a whole bunch of different things. What is the main focus behind something like this morning? I want us to focus upon our own actions. If we're not careful, we become like those Pharisees. We become like those spiritual leaders. We even become like those lawyers who seek to question, who seek to correct, who seek to follow after these things and place these troublesome burdens upon others while missing the focus of our day here today, while missing the purpose of our focus here this morning, which is to worship God. So let us be careful not to harshly look at others, but rather to do so in looking with mercy, with love, and with forgiveness, so that we can experience that great rest that Jesus has promised to those who follow after him. I hope this morning that if you are not a Christian, that you would be encouraged in knowing that you have a way to receive rest from your restlessness. You have an opportunity to be made whole, to be made complete, to wash away the sins of your life, allow for you to walk in newness of life, and that way is through the waters of baptism, through the blood that Jesus had shed upon that cross. Or maybe it's the case you've already done those things. You're already a Christian. You're following after the way. You're even supposed to be the one who's helping to lead others, but maybe like those Pharisees and those lawyers and those Jewish leaders, maybe you've strayed away. Maybe you've lost your focus of this day. This day has become empty and vain instead of a day of exaltation and worship because of your heart. I would encourage you to remove those things that separate you from God, to repent of your sins, to get back to doing what is right, so that we all can have unity and peace and love, worshiping the God that gives rest to restless people. Maybe it's the case this morning that you need rest. And if it is, please come while we stand and while we sing.